start. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my breakout room. My name is Edwin Ajogun, and I am going to be taking us through this very, very powerful and impactful breakout session. We're starting right now because we have, we have like an hour or so to go through this. It's going to be very, very wonderful, and I can't wait to get started. First of all, to introduce myself, my name is Edwin Ajogun. I'm the country director of ECHO Innovation Center, who wants to put together this particular program together. And so far, it's been a wonderful, wonderful ride, and we've had so much fun. We've had so much fun, and we cannot. I can't wait to start this journey with you in the next 1 hour. Right. Today, we're going to be discussing policy and startups and navigating the maze of policy changes. So we've had so many times in the last few years, where we see that startups themselves have been complaining about how policy itself is not necessarily in line with their own ideas of innovation. There's a narrative that says that the policy changes in the global space, especially with policymakers, are making the space of innovation dynamic, and we're wondering who's supposed to lead, developers or the builders or the policymakers, right? Now, the volatility in Nigerian or Africa's economies, the uncertainty that happens around all the ecosystems led by their governments and everything and their policymakers makes it, complex and ambiguous when it comes to designing solutions for short, medium, and even long term, right? And you feel like as a developer or as an innovator, like there's a big issue with it, and you want to know. We want to know, like, how can we be a step ahead, right? What are the points that we need to get across to be able to ensure that innovation is essentially ahead of policy, or rather they are going hand in hand, and we do not have one person fighting or colliding with another person, right? So that's basically the topic of what we will be discussing today. So I'm very glad to introduce some of my co-hosts. I believe that some others will be joining us very, very soon. Currently on this panel, I have Mr. Sheung Tubi, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Bank of Industry. Love to have him here. And I have Ozioko Bochuku with me. And so these are two people that I really respect a lot and who have actually been in the game of innovation and possibly policy. And I really, really, really cannot wait to hear from them, to hear what they have to say. Today is going to be very, very interesting. And I would like to just have a quick discussion with Mr. Sheung Tubi. So, like, in your own opinion, I know that you are one of the leaders in Bank of Industry, and you yourself have seen so many times in so many ways how policy has been affecting not just startups but even businesses as a whole. Now, the question I have to ask you is, based on your knowledge of how policy works in Nigeria, can you just walk us through what you think are the benefits of investing in a place that is considered quote unquote volatile in Nigeria? What are the opportunities do you think investors are missing out when talking about the Nigerian market, despite the so-called perceived volatility?
Okay, good afternoon. I hope I can be heard clearly. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you clearly, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me here. And it's a pleasure to be part of this breakout session. Well, the issue of policy in Nigeria is not, I think it's something that is clear, and is something that's generated so much debate in recent time. It's been on for a while, but in particular in recent time, we've seen a lot of activity, a lot of discussion in that space. Like you mentioned earlier, there is innovation, there is regulation, there is policy. Typically, and this is not just peculiar to Nigeria, innovation always comes before regulation. It is when people have, come up with an idea, they've identified, how to solve a particular problem, a particular challenge, and they've been able to identify what the solution is. They then proceed to build a business or to build a solution around it. That is when innovation then comes up. So it's unlikely that you have a regulation.
Hello.
Okay, yes. I think there was a glitch there. We'll wait a little bit, just for a second. I should proceed.
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, so I was talking earlier that typically in most cases, not just in Nigeria, you find innovation happening. People building a solution, people building the platform or building a business before regulation comes in. We must also recognize and appreciate the fact that within the business space or within life generally, there are different stakeholders, there are different parties to that all interact together. So you have the entrepreneur, the startup, the business that has identified a problem or a solution and has figured out a way to solve it. You also have the customer, people who are going to patronize or who are going to purchase these services or this product. You also have the suppliers, the partners. You have the investors, people who are putting down money. You have the government whose objective is to ensure that the society runs effectively. You have the regulator and many other parties, many other players within that space. So what regulation comes in or what policy comes in to do is to ensure that the interest, one way or the other, of all these players are well protected, such that you don't have one entity or one party, dominating or just, you don't have one entity or one party, making life difficult for the other. So when you look at, that kind of, scenario, you realize that, at the initial stage, when regulation comes on board, one party, usually, the people that, the entrepreneur, the startup that initiated that idea, they want to move very fast. They want to solve the problem. They want to make the money as quickly as possible. They want to convert all the opportunities as quickly as possible. But in most instances, there's the interest of all the other parties also must be put into consideration. And that is why usually it is the startups or the entrepreneur, the business owner that usually shout that, hey, the regulation is stifling them, it's not making them to grow, it's difficult. So in a nutshell, we must recognize that they are the interest of all the parties. However, one other thing that is also clear is that if the interest of everybody is that if the objective of everyone is that we want all our interests to be addressed, the customer wants to be able to pay for the service or take or enjoy the service at a fair price. The government wants to ensure that everything is going on well. The startup or the entrepreneur, the business want to ensure that the investment that has been made, the sweat equity, the idea that has been put forward, there is reward on it. Once that is the interest of everybody, I believe somewhere, that there should be that alignment of interest. That may not happen initially, but with constant dialogue, with constant engagement, with constant, each entity usually typically has to keep pushing. You continue to push the frontier, and as you push the frontier, you realize that one way or the other there will be an alignment of interest. So yes, Nigeria may have been in the news, for clearly obvious reasons, but we must also recognize and appreciate the fact that it is the responsibility of the regulator to ensure that all the interests of all the various stakeholders are protected in a way that the society will move forward. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So for real, I think it's very, very, very impactful, and what you've said, and it's deeper knowing that it's coming from someone in your position, and I mean, to know that you, in what you've been able to experience, and you understand how this works, and you were able to communicate this to us quite effectively, and I really appreciate you for that. But I just want to, I really want to understand, like, using the BOI in context. So, what can you give me like an example of a kind of policy that BOI has driven? I mean, using this Nigerian environment as an example, can you give me an example of kind of policy that the BOI has driven and what the outcomes of that policy has led to with respect to, you know, improving the state of the state of the Nigerian startup ecosystem?
All right. Well, okay, excellent. Let me start by saying that BOI is not really a regulator because we also have a license. We have a banking license. We're also regulated by the Central Bank of Nigeria. However, because of the unique role we play in the sense that we're a development finance institution owned largely by the government, but working based on private sector principles and practices. It is a lot easier for us to to speak to both sides, so to say, to understand where the caps of both sides. So sometimes we wear the cap as if we're a regulator, even though we're not a regulator. Sometimes we wear the cap as if we're complete, we're private sector entity. So we sit in the middle. So it's a very unique a position for us. Now, in terms of what we have done in the startup space, now as you know, startup space is emerging. The journey has just started in Nigeria. But in terms of specific things that we have done, now I will make this example. When before Nollywood became what it is today, BOI started something about 10 years or so ago. Now, when we realized that there's so much activity in that space, but it was largely unstructured. So it was like there's a high tempo, there's a lot of temperature, so to say. There's a lot of activity in that space. What BOI simply did at that time was to put together a committee of eminent people within that space. You have the likes of Jokel Silva and a few of them. So there was a committee put together to look at what is the best way that this space can be structured. That's that's the Nollywood space. And that committee system says, okay, the first thing to do is to ask for people that have ideas. You have a script. You don't have funding. Of how you don't have the fund to produce that. So what BOI did was to set up that committee that would then look at those scripts. They will look at someone's script. If they think that this makes sense, then they will bring it to BOI. BOI will fund it. At that time was extremely risky. There was no structure whatsoever to fund film business in Nigeria. And we did a few. Some were successful. Quite a number of them failed. But it was a journey that BOI was willing to go through because by our nature, we're a development finance institution. And so we went through that journey, and then, roll back 10 years after, you now have, CDN coming up with, a special fund for creative industry. You have different institutions, you have different banks, launching one fund or the other. That is the way, is the kind of role that BOI plays, so that was done specifically for startup. And today, you now have, for the Nollywood industry, you now have, investment across the entire value chain of the film and a creative industry. So you have the production, you have the distribution, you have even the infrastructure, and even across all these spaces, we have supported it. So that's one good example. Now, when you now look at the tech, the startup space, 5-6 years ago, when CC Hub just started, they approached us. they set up the CCO Growth Fund. You are invested in it. We're one of the first investor in that space. And I understand that if they've done they've invested in a few startups, and those startups are doing well. I think one of them is a Life Bank or so, the Life Bank startup that is doing well. We are also working with the federal government. I think we mentioned that earlier at our presentation yesterday. That we've set up a $75 million tech fund working with the government. The $500 million that the federal government is also putting together, we're also heavily involved in it. So in terms of policy and regulation, what we do is to influence it. We don't create it because we're not a policymaker, we're not a regulator. But because we're very close to that side, we work closely with them. Now, on the infrastructure side, there are a lot of other things that they're also in the pipeline, which in the new year we're going to unveil. So, but in a nutshell, our role as BOI, we recognize that there's a lot of temperature, just like we recognize the creative industry about 10 years or so, 10, 15 years ago. Also recognize that within that space, within the tech startup space, there's a lot of temperature, a lot of activities, and we are deliberately coming into that space to see how can we intervene from a development finance side, influence policy, influencing regulation, and also advocating on behalf of the startups themselves. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very, very much. That was very, very insightful. I like the fact that you were able to say that you're not necessarily a policymaker, but you also agree with the fact that you are very close to them. Because I see BOI as basically the enforcing arm of any policy that the federal government has when it comes to financing the small and medium enterprises and startups here in Nigeria. Because that's, to me, back of industry, that's basically your mandate. But then talking about the federal government, and I'm happy that we have someone who is very close to that space on this panel, Mr. Ife Adebayo, who is the SA on innovation to the Vice President of Nigeria. If you permit me, sir, I would like to ask you a question. What do you think about, what do you think that international VCs miss about Nigerian startups? And how do you think the federal government can be able to address that situation? What can they do to be able to help get the message of the viability of Nigerian startups out there, so that VCs not just want to give funding to startups, but also that they can give the kind of funding that doesn't necessarily cripple startups? Because we've seen it too many times that even when these VCs do give money, sometimes their conditions are very stringent, so many things. And what can you think that the government can do or is already doing to help change the narrative?
Thanks a lot, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I think we can look at these things. We can look at it through various prisms, right? So first, you said, what do we think? What I think international VCs are missing, and I think we have to first look at the role that international VCs have actually played. When you look at the likes of Paystack that was recently acquired, for example, by Stripe. And when you look at VCs that invested in the likes of Jopperman in the early stages, invested in the likes of Printivo, in the early stages, you find that international VCs have actually always taken a chance and taken an opportunity on Nigerian startups. But you also find that there is a sort of a mismatch between what the ecosystem is doing and then what government itself is doing. And like my brother from BOI had mentioned earlier, that we have to understand that there are different stakeholders and everybody needs to come together to work. So what you find is, you see doctors, for example, they have their medical, dental, something association, right? The MDCN, that via which they engage governments, they engage National Assembly, they engage regulators, they engage lawmakers, right? You have the farmers have their various associations, you have women have various associations, but you see this ecosystem, we work in silos. Nobody's really coming together in the ecosystem to say, let's come together and engage government. So what you find is that there is a mismatch between the things government is doing and the things that the ecosystem actually needs. And because we realized these things is why we started to engage with the ecosystem a lot more closely. And in 2018, the vice president went on a tech tour with a couple of startups and venture capitals from Nigeria, Silicon Valley, venture capitals and investors in Silicon Valley. And a lot of these startups that went with us on that trip were able to raise funds. Venture capital fund, for example, ventures platform fund, for example, raised that trip for the ecosystem. And on your question around what government needs to do to protect the startups more, I think it's two things. I think first, you need government needs to move at the pace of the ecosystem. The regulations, legislation needs to move at the pace of the ecosystem. So when you speak to local investors, for example, they tell you one of the biggest problems they have is that the regulations that are being required to have a fund in Nigeria actually limits the ability to be able to do that very quickly and to be able to invest very quickly. So you find that a lot of them like to invest, like to set up their funds in, Mauritius or Silicon Valley or somewhere, and then invest in Delaware or somewhere, and then invest in Nigerian startups from there. These are things that we on the side of government need to look at, that we need to engage further on. I think that we then started, led by the Honorable Minister of Communications and Digital Economy and the Office of the Chief of Staff to the President, being led by my brother Oswald Gubadia, is that we started what we call the Big Tent approach for the Nigeria Startup Bill. And what's the Big Tent approach? Big Tent approach is we brought everybody under one tent. So the ecosystem players, the public sector, development partner community, and we're working on what we call the Nigeria Startup Bill. Now, what this bill is looking to do is to provide opportunities across various pillars and to look at all these issues that you've spoken about. How do we protect startups? How do we protect investors? How do we incentivize venture capital funding and all of that? The startup bill has been through the Ministry of Justice, back to the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy, and should be presented to the Federal Executive Council before the end of the year, and hopefully should be passed very early in the first quarter of 2021, if our projections are right. But finally, before I end, very important for government is that as you look to regulate and as you look to legislate, government must understand that we cannot afford to be on the way. So the way I like to put it, government must be along the way, not on the way. What you have to do as government is to be along the way and provide the services that are needed, and not be on the way competing with the ecosystem, which is why I like some of the things that the Bank of Nigeria has done, for example, providing facilities that support the ecosystem as opposed to trying to engage and compete with the ecosystem in what they're doing. And I think we need to do a lot more of this. And that's why, like Shen had mentioned, the federal government is raising $500 million, which would launch sometime in the end of the first quarter of next year. Now, this $500 million is to support this ecosystem across 4 pillars. One is infrastructure. How can we support those who are doing last mile connectivity work? The second is skills. How do we train Nigerians at scale and provide the skills that are required for this ecosystem to thrive? The third is enabling environment. How do we, start to engage more? How do we help the ecosystem to engage more with policymakers? And then the final one is investment and funds. So you had mentioned how foreign investors are able to, when they come in and they have some stringent conditions. But what we are making is, on the side of government, we're making some money available. This money will be in the Bank of Industry and will be made available to venture capitals across the country, so that it's because it's government money, it's coming at a much with much more relaxed terms and conditions, and are able to match the investors, reducing their own risks and exposure as we go forward. So
awesome.
I think those are things
awesome.
I'll touch on for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to, I'm seeing that a lot of other panelists have joined us finally. So I'm just going to run through the people who are with us now. I can see Mr. Itok Ekpe, CEO of AutoCheck, very good friend of mine. I can see Toyin Ajus Ademuyiwa, the head of creativity and innovation at the OTCI Lagos State. I can also see Oyeka Akuma, the world famous Oyeka Akuma, CEO of Trips. Thank you very much for being here. And I think that's it. So I like the fact that we have a very balanced panel here of both policymakers and startups who are actually feeling the who get to benefit or feel the pains of whatever the policymakers do get to implement, how they when I mean pains and when I mean pains and benefits, I'm talking about how they are perceived by foreign VCs and even local VCs. So they are in a very good position to even give us a feedback. And I'm going to ask, I'm going to jump to this it's epic. But first of all, I'm going to also recognize Charles Sekwalo, the CEO or managing partner of Course Ventures, who is an African Pan-African investor in startups across Africa, and is someone that I actually respect a lot, and I'm happy he's here. But let me just quickly jump to Oyeka Akuma. Oyeka, I know you have several, you are a serial entrepreneur, you are world famous, you've done so much work in the agri-tech, mobility, housing, so many things. We've seen your progress from Crowdivest to Trips, so many other things you've done. And especially with Trips, you've moved from not just building locally, but also going beyond the shores of Nigeria. And then I know for a fact that you launched sometime not long ago in Canada, if I'm wrong, please correct me. But then, so you have experience in our market and their market. Can you just give us, from your own opinion, you put your feet in both sides, in both feet in both markets. Can you just tell us what you think we are doing wrong from a policy angle, and what you think from your experience, what you think Nigeria is not getting right at the moment, and what you think that we can do right from the policy angle? I mean, given the fact that we have some big time policy guys on this breakout session, what do you think we should be thinking about, talking about, from finance, from infrastructure, from providing the enabling environment for VCs, for startups? What do you think that they should be doing and that they're not doing now?
All right, Edwin, thanks a lot for having me. I'm excited to be here. I was in the session earlier on where I was showcasing Trips to the AOT audience. And so thanks for having us. Now, just going straight into the question you asked, it's a very tricky question. I remember when I first saw the topic, I was like, you want me to come and say things now that people will start saying, but you said. So So, but really, frankly speaking, I think speaking around startups and generally, if I look from my own perspective as an entrepreneur, trying to build businesses in Nigeria for people in Nigeria or for people outside of Nigeria across the continent, I think some of the things that I've experienced have been, one, for startups trying to raise money, I mean, locally, there's always the challenge of presenting to an investor where you're talking to him and saying, oh, I'm creating the solution for the Nigerian market. They understand that the market is big. They understand the market is huge. They understand that they have serious potential to really scale and do great stuff in the market. But the one big thing they always ask is the risk of government policies around startups that are touching different places that people look at sensitive. So you're talking whether it's fintech, you're talking even any other sector that the government plays a major role in. So it's transportation, it's housing. So all of these things always goes across the mind of the investors, and they say, hey, how are we sure that the risk of one government just changing hands to the other will not wipe out your business? How are we sure that the risk of the currency of the Naira being devalued against the dollar will not affect our investment, where when you raise the money of $1 million, you got $1 million at 300 Naira. And now you're looking at growing this business, and maybe you've, unfortunately for the business, raised that money in dollars as a loan, and now you want to pay back, and you're supposed to pay back to that investor in 3, 4, 5 years. Maybe the business has done so well, you've even scaled, you want to sell the business. But you're saying now, and you want to sell it now at Naira value of 600 million Naira. But when you change it back into dollars, it comes back to, if you use the black market rate today, $1.2 million. And you're saying to yourself, how do you manage those kind of risk? So those are things that kind of hinder how investors look at businesses in Nigeria. There's also the issue around license. and getting licenses to play. One of the startups that I was involved in and invested in heavily was trying to get a particular license from one of the major government parastatals for a period of 10 months. Now that startup found itself in the position where, because the license didn't come up in time, it affected the structure of the business so badly that they had to find alternative ways of setting up their business, not originally according to their plan, but only because the license for them to operate with didn't come out in time. They had to find an alternative. And in finding the alternative, they couldn't reach the peak of what they wanted to build out of that business. And it just in itself affected the way they structured their business. One of the things they then did quickly was they took that business out of the country, registered it outside Nigeria, got their license outside Nigeria, and came back as a foreign startup operating here. That was the only way they could successfully get going and eventually have their foot on the ground. Today, everybody wants to celebrate them, but nobody recognizes the fact that they went through the pain of trying to get their lessons and doing this from here faster, doing this from here locally, but they couldn't get that done only because they couldn't get their license in time. And they eventually got that in 24 to 48 hours outside. So when we look at the different reasons why investors look at Nigerian startups and try to look at them from the risk space to the regulatory space, and as much as they're excited about the energy, they're excited about the market, they're excited about the potential of the market, these things become a problem. For us in my business, very quickly, what we did was we had to hedge our risk by finding ways to see. We operate in one market, we operate in two markets, we operate in three markets. If one market becomes too slow or goes down, there are 2 or 3 other markets that will hedge the risk. And that has influenced how we've eventually grown our business. That has influenced how we've also structured the business, where we're not solely focused on just being a Nigerian startup solely, but finding our ways to say, how do we manage our risk across different markets outside of this region, just in case something goes wrong? So those are the challenges one has to face. Some of the challenges, I mean, I can go on and talk more about other challenges people face, but just giving a perspective of my own, and that is something that people face that is really, really a struggle. First thing I'll say is, we talk about the ease of doing business. But talk about the ease of doing business from a place where we want to showcase how fast people can register the businesses and start businesses out of Nigeria. I think over time, I've come to see that in many markets, not just in Nigeria, I mean, many markets across Africa, I found it's in some way even easier getting some things off the ground, even for a Nigerian business compared to us doing things here. And so those are things that I want to see maybe some changes to, protecting we want to reduce how many startups start out of Lagos, but eventually want to register in Delaware or want to register in Toronto. If we want to stop that, then you give them the same covering, you give them the same platform that they will get like those other businesses, you give them the same protection, and then they will stay here and they won't feel threatened by the environment where they're trying to grow and build solutions for.
I agree with you. I sincerely agree with you. Thank you very much. And it's something that I understand that you take very personally, because you've been there, you've seen the effects in real time, and you've seen the amount of money and potential we've lost by not providing or by not having all these things in place, right? But the good thing that we are moving forward. I mean, there are a lot of things that we've put in place now to get us to where we innovators want Nigeria to be able to build these things locally. Now, but then I still understand that we need to take the market currently the way it is, right? Because if we do not understand what's happening now, it's going to be very difficult for us to even offer solutions to the problem. And this is where I want to talk to Itop Ekwe. Now, Itop, I know that you just raised about $2.5 million or thereabouts, or $1.2 million. Correct me when I'm wrong, please. Now, I'm sure that process was very tedious for you. And you must have been in conversations over a long period of time with different investors. We that were in venture building, we understand how difficult and tedious that process can be. Now, from your opinion, I mean, from the conversations you've had with investors, what do you think? What do you think are? How do you think that the local VCs? What ways of feedback from the local VCs? How do they perceive your startup? What are the things that they say about startups here in Nigeria, and how did you perceive how do you think that the VCs, local and international VCs, perceive African startups, and where do you think that we are getting it wrong, and how do you think we can make it better?
So I think, I mean, in a way, I can't really say, you know, to be frank, I didn't really get any money locally. So, and it's not because it's not there. It's just, I mean, in a way, I've spent quite a bit of time on the tech scene. So I wouldn't really say, okay, in my case, I would go through what a typical first-time entrepreneur would be going through, right? So it's a bit different. I just want to be very clear around that.
Sorry to cut you short, but can you just confirm how much you raised?
Our last raise was 13.4 million.
Oh, 13.4. So I was like 10% off the mark. Fantastic.
Yeah. So I wouldn't really benchmark and say, but just giving the way I've always seen it is, it's a globalized market, right? So I mean, I think that if I take my journey and what began to help me understand truly how the investment scene when it comes to tech startups was, I've been through a process whereby I've written to 3,000 VCs over a period of 3 months, right? I was looking for money and I wrote, emailing VCs across the world, 3,000, and I got one no. I got one response, and that response was, we're not interested. The rest of them didn't. But just in terms of efforts and trying to raise capital and effort, I've put in that effort. But after doing that, I mean, it gets to a point where you kind of realize that there's something wrong with what I'm doing, as to not even about anyone. And I think that getting a clear understanding that, number one, at the end of the day, if you understand the way, I think the perception is that VC money for it's not free money, right? It's people's savings, pensions, investment plans that they are looking for high returns on, right? VCs are telling people who have capital that I can provide returns for them. So in a sense, it operates like the capital market, just in a smaller way, right? So I think that when you think about it from that perspective, then you do realize that the same demands that are placed upon the capital markets in terms of returns is the same demands that, as an individual, you have to think about it from a perspective whereby people expect returns if they're going to put this money into your business. So with that kind of mindset in place, you then understand that. And so if you look at the way the capital markets run, right, when companies are releasing their quarterly earnings calls, what's the sound of death? No growth.
Mm-hmm.
No growth. The minute you release your earnings call and there's a slight, you're not growing quarter on quarter, the first thing that happens is that your stock declines instantly, 5%, 10%. Or if there's generally news that why is this fundamentally so? Because there's a perception at that point in time that this business will not be able to provide investment, right? For people who want to get return on their investment. So the minute, and that's what typically a very well-performing business ensures, that it's constantly providing investments for its shareholders. So if you understand that kind of mindset, and the funds are not there from, yes, they're high-risk funds, but at the end of the day, people want return on investment. So then that clarity one was something that I realized that, okay, it means that if I wanted to present my business to any VC, not local, not international, right? It means that my business has to appear to them in a way that when they look at it, it is guaranteed to provide returns.
Yeah.
Simple as that, right? Because that's what they typically want to do. So, and I think that the mentality that exists typically, or I would say it's now beginning to change sort of around local entrepreneurs, is that it's a charity, event. You're going to people and saying, I need money for my business, help me out, I have a good idea. And so when you look at it from a VC perspective, right, think about the fact that in this day and age, right, a VC can receive, you're going to a Silicon Valley VC, there may be, if they're high demand VC, maybe they're receiving conservatively 100 proposals a day, right, from at least 30 different countries every day. Mm-hmm. So you're in a highly competitive market. So for instance, you can mention some things about risk and things like that. So if you're going to present your own case, right, how are you going to ensure that, whatever it is you're doing will compete with any global business in terms of return and growth rates? Mm. So when you look at your business from that perspective, that determines the sector you're going to go into, the business you're trying to do, the rate at which you think about the business and how big it can be. So that fundamental thinking cascades down to how you approach everything, right? And so I think that, if I wanted to draw, and so my approach, typically, or what I've learned over time has been that understand that you're in a very competitive environment, first of all, right? And what people are looking for is an opportunity. I can guarantee you that if you have an opportunity that is growing 50% month on month for the next 2 years, there's no VC in the world that will not take the risk, right? And the higher the risk, you understand? So yes, there's a risk premium, but there's a growth, and we've seen businesses now coming out of Africa that are typically commanding much higher investment. It's not a fluke. It's because a lot of these founders as well have if you look at the tech ecosystem, it's transitioned from what I would call fanciful foreign mirrors, right? There's a foreign product that looks great, is domesticated, and is expected to perform the same way, to real problem solving. That's the era that we're in. People are going into sectors that are not particularly pretty, they are not fun, they are not the most popular, but these are where the core problems in the country exist and in the environment exist, and they are tough to solve. And this is where people are typically deploying technology solutions towards solving, and that is where you are seeing the high rate of returns. And that's why you see startups attracting funding. So for me, I think that mismatch had existed before, but you find that a lot of, I would say, entrepreneurs are moving beyond that phase of fanciful, I would say, consumer internet, pretty things, and trying to actually solve problems. And I think that in the same way as well, the VCs themselves also, because you see, the ecosystem is still modeled to look for tech entrepreneurs that are modeled after the typical Silicon Valley. So you speak a certain way, you must know your way around the media. But the reality is that the gems in the market, right, today are people that might not necessarily find their way or know how to work the media, all these things that happen, right? They might just be sitting there doing their businesses effectively, but might not know a lot around how to approach or structure a business. And so a VC might be sitting down and waiting for someone to approach them, not really going into the market to go and actually look for who is solving a problem that has that really is scaling effectively. And I think for me, if I was going to look at how I would advise, or what I think that VC should do, is just typically spending a lot more time identifying businesses. I know so many people that, maybe, their businesses will not make it onto the front cover of some of the media magazines, or might not be here, but are doing tremendously well. And I always ask myself that, why is it that why aren't these guys attracting funding? You understand? Because they don't wear t-shirts with brand, or they don't have fancy offices. So I think as well, the mismatch in terms of how we look at, or what we look at in terms of what is investable, and then the effort you're going to place with some of those companies in terms of how they are going to be structured to provide those investments are also important as well. So that kind of that would kind of be my my contributions and views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you so much. I like the way you really presented that. It's very, very insightful and very, very interesting. So now we've been talking about investors. Let's take it back. Let's walk it back a little bit. Now, when it comes to policy, policy and products are always, they are two sides of the same coin, right? You do not always want, the products that are being designed always have to take account of the policies that exist and potentially might exist to be able to be relevant, right? Now, that now means that there needs to be some kind of connection between designers and policymakers, which in a way Eco Innovation Center and AOT tries to provide. But then we've seen cases like with Bitcoin and so on and so forth, where government has just been no. Now, that means that there are areas where no matter how interesting the innovation is, there are just some innovations that the government itself will not just accept. Now, I would like to ask Mrs. Ademiyowa, Mrs. Toyin Andrews Ademiyowa. Now, why does this exist? Why is it that the Nigerian government, both local, both statewide and national-wide, why do you think they have this, I don't want to say reputation, but I would say this, there's this, what's the word now? There's this expectation that the government on the policy is just another obstacle that you need to, overcome to build your product. I mean, I've seen so many business model canvases when we receive pitch decks from different entrepreneurs, and sometimes you see that government positioning policy is one of their risk factors. Now, why do you think that this exists, and what can the government do, both statewide and nationally, and maybe even across Africa? What can government do to correct this impression and even maybe be more active in the co-creation aspect of beauty products in Africa?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Clearly, ma'am.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. When I first saw this topic, I was really, really happy that I was on this panel, not because I work for government, but because I'm an advocate for startups thriving without any bottlenecks. So there was a report, I think it was July 2021 in the US, and that report argues that state and local policymakers should slash regulatory barriers for startup businesses. There's a reason why that came out, right? Then there was another one that says state government should repeal certificates of needs, requirements, and so on and so forth when it comes to startups. Now, in Nigeria, in Nigeria, we have two problems. You have the federal government's expectations, you have the three problems: state government expectations, you have the local government expectations. And it becomes a bigger problem for anyone that wants to become an employer of labor, right? So I believe the responsibility for government really to ensure that every startup thrives and there are no issues. First, let's start with the local government. Local government should reduce and simplify permitting and license rules for all new businesses, period. So there should be a synergy. There should only be a one-stop shop for all these fees and all these licenses, which I believe Lagos State government is already has in the pipeline. They should also liberalize what I call IBILE rules or zoning rules for startup businesses, because once you do that, especially our youths, they just want to start their business with little or less government all over them, but yet still create an enabling environment for them to employ, for them to be successful. And so for me, government should just find a way to ensure that the rules, when it comes to licensing fees, right now we have radio fees, we have television fees, we have all these fees that is not appearing to be an enabler for startups. For Lagos State government is currently working on the startup bill, and that is to reduce the gestation period. But that startup bill is sort of classified into 2 or 3 areas, right? So you have companies that you have investors that invest in R&D, right? Then you have some companies that grow to create jobs. And then, so for instance, there's a growth trajectory for Google that is quite different from, let's say, what is the next biggest company? Let's say
Amazon?
PW. Say that again?
Amazon?
Amazon, right? Those are 2 different growth trajectory, right? When you compare Amazon to Jumia in Nigeria, those are, I mean, they're far in between, right? So Lagos State government has decided, like, listen, what we need to do collectively, we need to ensure that the regulations, the laws and regulations are friendly, are clear, are planned, and they work for all startups, tech ecosystems specifically. So that bill is currently being worked on now, and I believe the federal government, to my understanding, are also doing the same thing. And so once we can be in congruence with the needs of our startups, and that the startups are also in congruence with the needs of government, with limited, and I say limited, expectations from our small business owners, then I think we're good to go. So for me, the bottom line is that we need to have an enabling environment to drive sustainable growth and sociability. And the only way you're going to have that is to ensure that these policies are not harsh, they're not cumbersome, they're not, they don't appear to be punitive and appear to be policies that are victimizing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's very, very interesting. Thank you so much. It's like you said, I'm glad that the government has someone like you that is an advocate for removing the bottlenecks that startups face when they are deploying their products across the state and across the country. And we need someone like that. We need someone who's in our corner. We need more people in our corner in the government. I'm sure all the founders here at this call will agree with me. So thank you so much. We can clone you hundreds of times.
No problem.
I know a lot of people who are also in your shoes, like the SA or innovation is one of our biggest advocates, our biggest challenges in government. And we really, really want to have more people like you in our corner in government advocating for our needs. And it's we really, really appreciate you, madam. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Now, I would like to take us back to the African scene, right? Now, there's still, I mean, for us at AOT, we are very big on not just tackling problems that are local here in Lagos and local in Nigeria, but then Africa itself, for us, should be a world power when it comes to delivering innovation. So now, Mr. Charles Esekwalo, you are basically very, very, very well versed when it comes to investing in startups in different states and different countries in Africa, and you will be the best person to tell us this. What exactly do you think? Where do you think the African startup ecosystem is going? Where are the opportunities for VCs in the African ecosystem, and how do you think we can be able to? How do you think that they can be able to tap into this space? Using your own experience as an example.
Yeah, thank you, Edwin, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I think these conversations, both within a Nigeria context, but also within a global and African context, is so important to have. Just very quickly about my background, there's an investment angle, but there's also, I think, the other part, which is often overlooked, but goes hand in hand with investment, which is people, right? And ultimately, you capture capital and you need to deploy that capital and you need people to do something with that, right? And I think from an African continent perspective, we ultimately need to collaborate more. I think there's a massive, massive opportunity on the table here. And I mean, Africa needs to recognize that as individual states, we probably can't do it alone, right? There's a lot that we can learn from each other. And we almost need to start building centers of excellence, right? So I think even Nigeria as a region that is ultimately Africa's powerhouse in terms of population, in terms of GDP, in terms of so many different things, I'd love to see Nigeria taking a lead in solving for some of these challenges, right? In the same way that we're actually seeing places like Rwanda take a lead. So I think Rwanda has become a very popular spot for many international investors, but also international entrepreneurs and African entrepreneurs, because of we've had it mentioned already, the ease of doing business, the ease of starting a business, the pace at which, the track record of showing how actually regulation can change very quickly and very dynamically. And almost this kind of less of a fear factor, more transparency, which ultimately is super important for capital to flow in. But I think what I would really encourage when we look at it from an African perspective is, I think there almost needs to be some sort of activity at a more African Union level, right? I think if you take startups, for example, an African Union level, but also just the startups and investors themselves being quite proactive in working cross-continental. Over the last 5-6 years, the pattern that we've seen emerge more and more is organizations are starting in one country, and then very quickly they're looking quite far afield. So we've seen startups start in Kenya, very quickly they're looking at Nigeria, and vice versa, right? And then maybe after that comes Francophone Africa. On one hand, it helps to diversify risk, right? In a way, you could say that if you look at various different regions and how they peg their currencies across, whether it's the euro, the franc, the US dollar, there is some sort of risk, de-risking that's taking place there. But it's also in search for opportunity, right? And so we have to sort of accept that this is more of a continental market now, right? So from a startup's perspective, if you're in a fintech in Nigeria and you're struggling with some of the challenges around regulation or even how you navigate around policy, you should probably be speaking to people in East Africa or South Africa, right? And learning from those individuals. And then that should be also filtering up to levels which cut across the regions. And that's where I think the African Union can play a role. I said at the beginning that there's a huge opportunity here for Africa. And I think over the last 5 years, we've seen the trends, we've seen what's happening with startups to the degree that international investors who, for the last 6, 7 years of my career, I've been working with to try and help them understand the African ecosystem. It seems like they get it now, right? And in a way, you could argue that we're being left behind a little bit, and this tipping point is going to come where previously we had African countries being served by international companies, right? And then we started to make this shift, and we had African countries being served by African founders. But it feels like with where the investment cycle is going, where is that ownership ultimately going to lie, right? And how is that capital going to flow back into the continent? Is it coming through the founders and local investors, or is it going out into international investors and then potentially deployed into other regions? So there's an opportunity there, and I think the African Union and leaders of state have an opportunity, but also I would say an obligation to work together and be a little bit experimental, take a few risks. I think sometimes the conversation is a little too negative around policy is getting in the way, regulation is getting in the way. I think if we could change the narrative a little bit and just say, how could we use these things to our advantage, right? How can we work together, be a little bit more entrepreneurial, so to speak, a little bit more experimental, to say, let's create these small centers of excellence and try things out, right? We can manage for the downside, but the upside potential is unbounded. And so that's where I think you've got policymakers, you've got investors, you've got startups who can potentially come together and collaborate a lot more, right? To ultimately say, if regulation is behind product, if regulation or policy is behind the entrepreneurial thinking, how can we actually come together across regions and start helping policymakers to actually shape regulations, to shape the policies of tomorrow?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And it's great that you are in your own position, that you hopped around continents. I know you started Move Me Back, you started some other startups, and you basically know what it's like, to run a Pan-African a business. So yeah, your contribution is actually very important and very, very, very valuable. Thank you so much. Now, at this point, I would like to take questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question? Just please put it in the chat, and let's direct it at someone if you need to. Let's know. Let's hear what you have to say. And then while we're waiting for people to put their questions in the chat, just and to even see what we can get from even the streaming channels, I just want to just ask Mr. Ifed Adebayo. I know you're still on the call. Please, we've talked about the challenges and everything. Now, you are in government and you are seeing what is being done. I'm not a fan of talking about problems. But in 1 minute, can you just give us based on what you're saying, the future of the Nigerian African tech ecosystem, based on what is being done now to move it forward? Where do you see us being in the next 2 to 3 years? In 1 minute.
I think the future is very bright. I think the opportunities are very, very plenty, And when you look at where investments have been going over the last few years, you find that Nigeria has been leading in the amount of investments that the tech startup community has been able to raise. However, I think there are also two things that need to be done. First is I think the ecosystem must engage more with government. And second, I think government itself must engage more with the ecosystem. for us to be able to do the things we need to do, for us to be able to hit the numbers we need to hit, we all have to work together. And I also think that on the side of government, you need to have a lot more ecosystem players even engaged in policy making, engaged in decision making, engaged in taking up office, because the ecosystem must stop treating those who engage government like lepers. They have leprosy, I can't touch them. You need to encourage more people within the ecosystem to get into the space. The Bible, sorry for referencing that, the Bible says that you have to enter into the house of a strong man to bind him.
First, yeah.
And you see, there is no policy without politics. So you can't tweet your way to good policies, and you unfortunately cannot test your way to good policies. You have to engage government, you have to get into government, and you have to make those changes while inside government. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. So I love the fact that you ended with that question, that statement, say that you have to engage government to be able to influence any policy or any direction that the government is going when it regards its thoughts and actions towards startups. But I'm going to ask Mrs. Andrews now, Mrs. Adimiwa. You are in Lagos State government. Now, someone has asked a question which I think is very, very important. Why is it that we do not get to see the process of policy being crafted? We only get to see the announcement, right? Why are we not carried along? Why is it that it's only at the level of the government house that this policy has been deployed? We don't get to see townhouses. We don't get to see the engagement at the grassroots with startups before these policies are made public or are being enforced. A very, very good example for us, and when I say good example of stakeholders for us, because I consider stakeholders as both the government and even the startups themselves and even their users. Why do you think like for example the bikes that were banned, with all the investment that were made in the mobility industry, and there was a circular that happened, and everything was stopped, just like that. No engagement, it caught everybody by surprise. Now, why does that happen? Why doesn't the government engage us more in making these policies? And what do you think can be done to make that better? In 1 minute, Mark.
All right, thank you. I think that's the wrong perception. Every policy, again, I'll speak for Lagos State government, every policy includes everybody. None of our policies are done in isolation, okay? The Lagos State House of Assembly, the governor's office, local government, private sector, the lodgers, everybody is part of every single policy that is being created, or if we decide to jettison. And so in terms of the motor bikes industry of what happened, that didn't just happen overnight. There was a long conversation, almost maybe a month and a half or so before that decision was made. And the reason why it even took that long is because we needed to ensure that all stakeholders were part and parcel of that discussion. I think what the problem is that we're not visible enough when we're actually putting those policies together with everybody. And I think we need to be visible enough. We need to do more advocacy around that. So when new policies are coming, we need to do better in terms of letting everybody know.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're about to close the breakout room now, about the main session. I appreciate everybody for their time and for their expertise. Thank you, and we'll see you at next next AOT. Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much, Mr. Tubi, Oyeka, Mr. Adebayo. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing this with us. And for our viewers all around the world, thank you for joining us. And I hope that you follow us and you are listening and learning, and we will get. And I want to offer you, if you're listening to us from as an investor, I need you to understand that the Africa tech ecosystem is where you need to be putting your money in, because we are moving forward and you need to move forward with us. Thank you so much for everything you've done thank you so much for everything you've been able to bring to the table, my speakers. And I'll see you guys next year, hopefully, or maybe in between in another episode, in another seminar or breakout room or anything. Thank you.